Hey there, everybody. It's the Queso You Didn't Know show. I'm Queso, and as always, I'm joined by.
Alberto Simpson.
So, we got a real treat for you guys. We're breaking up the Asian saga. We're going to get a little fucking spooky today. I want you to close your eyes. Imagine the deepest cold you have ever felt. Not the cold of a chilly morning waiting for the bus. I mean the cold of the deep boreal forest in January. 40 degrees below zero. The kind of cold where the air hurts your lungs, where the trees explode, literally explode because the sap inside them freezes and expands like a bomb. You are alone. The snow is waist deep, the silence is absolute, and you haven't eaten in 3 weeks. Your stomach isn't just empty, it is digesting itself. Your body is consuming its own muscle, its own fat. You are starving. The hunger is a physical pain, a clawing emptiness that screams for relief. And in that desperation, you look at your companion. Maybe it's your brother. Maybe it's a child. For a split second, they don't look like family anymore. They look like meat. That thought, that terrifying, intrusive thought that violates every law of nature and love, that is the Windigo. Today we are venturing into the darkest corners of North American folklore. We are talking about the Windigo, a creature that is part physical monster, part spiritual infection, and part cultural warning. We are going to strip away the Hollywood version. Forget the antlers. Forget the werewolves. Forget the generic monster in the woods. The real Wendigo is much scarier because it looks like us. It is the embodiment of greed, selfishness, and the hunger that can never be satisfied. We are going to look at the ancient oral traditions of the Cree and the Ojibwe, exploring a mythology that predates European contact by centuries. We are going to analyze the tragic, real life case of Swift Runner, a man who ate his own family and claimed possession, a case that became a collision point between indigenous worldview and colonial law. And we are going to explore how this ancient myth has mutated in the modern world into a powerful metaphor for colonialism and capitalism. This isn't just a ghost story. This is a story about what happens when the social contract breaks down and we are left alone in the cold. It is a story about the fragility of humanity when pushed to the absolute brink.
I'm loving it. And before anything else, I think it's safe to say that Canadian winters are kind of similar to Chicago winters, if not more brutal, you know? I'm sure
There's that
those
lake
are,
effect. That lake effect makes a huge difference.
oh, yeah. And all in all, intrusive thoughts being considered a monster, I think that's a nice concept. There's always those conversations or those elements that are kind of taboo to talk about. Speaking of things that I saw recently, I recently saw somebody talk about how a certain movie made them not want to go to prison, especially after seeing that, because they know what people are subjected to and how people are basically brought down to a really primal animal like nature, you know? And you know, this is another conversation to where it gets like that, to where if if you're brought down to a certain act of a certain level of desperation, a certain low level of life, what would really go on? It's an uncomfortable conversation, but this is really what I figured is kind of up your alley between me and you, because I know you've always been a fan of those conversations. Like, okay, and it kind of sounds messed up, but like if you have to choose between letting letting a certain animal that certain old perverted rich fucks would just let run through their anus and run through their body for pleasure and for fun, if you had to choose between doing something like that and letting such and such person die, what would you choose? And I know that those are the type of conversations that you're into, so I can picture this being something that kind of fits your fancy.
Now, everybody, I do not put gerbils up my asshole. That was Richard Gere. I need that on the
Right,
record.
right.
But no, I feel that exactly, and I think that was a perfect comparison that you gave. That it's not just an intrusive thought, it goes to when that intrusive thought is fed upon. And I think that becomes a very dangerous thing. And that's what a lot of these old mythologies and folklores and stuff like before you had Nessie, you had the Kelpie in Scotland, and the Kelpie was a metaphor for trying to trick kids and not going down by the river. The same for La Llorona in Mexico. It's kind of a tale you tell kids to keep them in line, yes, but it's also so they don't go drown in the river when they want to go play. This is sort of similar in the sense that it's what happens when you go over that edge. You become a monster, and we have to come up with a way to describe this monster in a mythologized way that helps you understand you're not supposed to eat anyone when you're starving. It's weird to think about, but like at the end of the day, even all religions, they're just stories. So when you think about love thy neighbor and shit, it is just a story. I'm not knocking anyone's faith. I'm saying at the end of the day, even if you don't believe it, you can take things from that story and understand the metaphor behind it.
Yeah, yeah, that's what it's all about at the end of the day, I suppose. And it's really horror movie-esque, I'll say, these stories, but they get the point across, you know.
And the scarier the better, and the more power it has. And you'll see that with us going down the rabbit hole. Let's start with what a Wendigo is. The Wendigo, or Wittigo, Windigo, or Wendigo, four or five different spellings. You can spell it with E's, you can spell it with I's, you can spell it with T's and K's. But at the end of the day, the name varies across Algonquin languages. That terror, though, is universal. It is not a cryptid like Bigfoot. Bigfoot is an animal. The Wendigo is a human who has gone wrong. The descriptions from oral histories are horrifyingly specific and steeped in the imagery of starvation. It is a giant, sometimes described as growing to 15 feet tall, but it isn't bulky like a bear, it's emaciated. Its skin is pulled tight over its bones like dried parchment or ash gray leather. Its eyes are sunken deep into the sockets, glowing with a weird bioluminescent light, or sometimes described as rolling in blood. It smells of decay and decomposition, a walking corpse. But the most disturbing detail, its lips. The Wendigo has chewed off its own lips. Why? Because its hunger is so overpowering, so constant, that in the absence of prey, it eats itself. It consumes its own body in a frenzy of insatiable appetite. The physical form is a perfect metaphor. The legend says the Wendigo grows in size every time it eats. If it eats a human, it grows larger in proportion to the meal. So, it is never fully full. It is always starving. The more it consumes, the more it needs to consume to sustain its growing bulk. This is the paradox of greed. It is a biological impossibility that perfectly describes addiction and avarice. You can never eat enough to be satisfied because the act of eating makes you hungrier. And it has powers. It can mimic human voices. Imagine being alone in the woods and hearing your grandmother calling your name from the darkness. That's the Wendigo trying to lure you away from the safety of the fire. It uses your love and your trust against you. It has a heart made of ice. To kill it, you don't just shoot it. You have to shatter that ice heart. You have to melt the coldness that has taken over the soul. But here's the key distinction from Western movie monsters. The Wendigo isn't just a beast you fight, it's a condition you catch. You can become a Wendigo by being bitten, yes, but you can also become one by dreaming about it, or by being cursed by a shaman, or most terrifyingly, simply by letting greed into your heart, by engaging in hoarding behavior, by putting yourself above the community. It is a moral infection as much as it is a physical one.
This is really, I said horror movie-esque, but it's kind of, well, I guess you could say children's movie-esque as long as that children's movie is The Grinch. You know, it's really reminiscent of what the Grinch all about. It's really a story about a person who is just really shameful and just really killjoy to people's holiday cheer, you know, and it's really a story revolved around shaming that type of person and ultimately dehumanizing them as much as this does, you know, with all the body imagery and shit like that and growing and never being full. It's really metaphorical in senses, it seems, to people who are high in power, you know, as far as growing but never being full. And I mean, if there's one thing that's hot of a topic right now, it's just it's people who are high up, so to speak, who are growing but still not yet full or just really in really slimy situations to say the least. But yeah,
And I think both of those analogies are spot on. And the Grinch, that's definitely the best way to describe it in the sense that at the end of the story, when we talk about melting and shattering its icy heart and stuff, sometimes, as you'll see later on, it can be a simple act of kindness that reverses the curse. And that's what it was in the Grinch, that he realized, oh, I don't want to be greedy. I took everything from these people and they're still happy. They're still loving each other. Why? And then they accept him into their hearts. He gives the shit back, yes, but even before then, they would have still let him come be a part of the community. And I think that plays a big part in this. And I think you're spot on with your comparing it to CEOs or certain presidents or other politicians nowadays. That is their humanity completely gone, or is there a chance they can come back? I guess only time will tell. But from the way the story plays out, it can go one of two ways.
right, right. Yeah, that's pretty fair. That's pretty fair. And
You'll see that as this goes on, that it's just that was a good comparison with Dr. Seuss, that this really is the scary version. Makes you wonder if he was aware of the story or just how that human that whole collective unconscious really affects everything in our day to day.
all in all, I think that it is more so being described at least as something that's conditional and not necessarily eternal.
And I think you're bringing up a good point because once you go in and understand the Wendigo, to understand it, you have to understand the environment that created it. And I think that conditional comparison really shines through here because the Algonquin speaking peoples, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Niskapi, the Innu, lived in some of the harshest environments on Earth. And this is why your Chicago comparison was spot on, where they both kind of located near the Great Lakes, the Canadian Shield, the boreal forests. Winter there isn't just a season, it's a siege. It is a months-long battle for survival against freezing temperatures and dwindling food supplies. Resources are scarce. A bad hunting season could mean death for an entire family. Survival depends entirely on sharing. If a hunter kills a moose, he shares it with the village. If he hoards it, the village starves. Reciprocity isn't just polite, it's the law of survival. The Wendigo is the anti-citizen. It represents selfishness. It represents the guy who eats extra rations while his neighbors go hungry. It represents the violation of the communal bond. In these cultures, hoarding isn't just rude, it is a capital crime. It was a threat to the species. So the Wendigo myth served a vital social function. It was a boogeyman with a purpose. It taught children do not be greedy, do not isolate yourself, stay with the group, share what you have. The Cree have a fascinating distinction in their beliefs. They believe in two types: the supernatural Wendigo, the giant spirit monster of the woods, and the human Wendigo, a person who has been corrupted. They look normal, but they are dirty, unkempt, and their eyes have changed. They are insidious because they look just like us. They walk among us, hiding their hunger. The Ojibwe have a slightly different take. They view it as a psychological slash spiritual imbalance. They believe humans have two souls. The Windigo possession happens when these souls are out of balance, usually due to extreme isolation or trauma. This turns the Wendigo from a monster into a tragedy. It's a person who has lost their way. It frames the condition not just as evil, but as a sickness of the spirit. There is even a rare Ojibwe story about a woman healing a Wendigo. Instead of killing the ice giant, she treats it with kindness. She feeds it hot bear fat, grease, and warm soup. The heat melts the icy heart. The monster vomits up the ice and becomes human again. Think about the profundity of that. The cure for the ultimate evil isn't a silver bullet, it's soup. It's community. It's warmth. It's reintegrating the isolated individual back into the circle of care.
Interesting. And all in all, I think it ended at the correct point because it kind of aims at what I wanted to get at as far as just the importance of community, not just in that sense, but in examples like that of the tribal community or just overall more beneficial to spread what you have and to just feed as many people as you could because the more people that could be fed the more people that you have ultimately me and you doing our research and of course lots of other people they'll find out that ultimately agricultural lifestyle won and became the basis for our advanced life now because and older humans figured out that the more people that we can feed, the more people we ultimately have for our tribe, the stronger we are. And this is really the an experiment, so to speak, showing that.
You are dead on that. And it serves as a warning tale because sometimes you need a boogeyman to make people actually want to do these things. When you're raised from a little kid to believe, I'll become a monster if I don't share, it makes sharing a lot more appealing. And we can argue all day on are humans altruistic by nature or not, but I think these stories do prove them to serve a purpose. The same way a kid now reading The Grinch is going to be able to understand the same lesson these Algonquin children did back then. No matter how you tell it, it's still framing it as don't be a dick, share what you have.
Yeah, I mean, there's always some form of that. I think I mean, we all remember hearing tales of the boogeyman growing up as a kid. And I think I even remember hearing shit like if you don't be good and go to bed, the boogeyman is coming to get you. Shit like that, you know. Though that's always gonna be a thing.
But once you tie it back into this society, I think it plays a bigger purpose then. And I think it starts to tell you the morals of a society, so to speak, when you see what their boogeymen are. That this is a boogeyman literally saying, if you don't share, you'll basically become a demon. And it tells you a lot about the significance of, as you said, the community and giving back to the community. And it tells you kind of what their morals were about in the same way other cultural folklores and myths do. And it's kind of amazing to see how being part of the tribe and making sure everyone had enough was so important that they created a monster around remember its importance so you don't become this creature.
Yeah, and I think the whole pre their whole outlook on things, it can be looked at as the most in one way or another sophisticated because I don't know if sophisticated is necessarily the word, but just the fact that they apparently really believed in a giant spirit monster of the woods somewhere out there. Apparently that was a legit belief of theirs, but they brought it back to real life and they realize that, okay, this thing may be out there, but there's human versions of this that look just like us that we need to deal with and recognize ultimately.
Exactly. And I think the other part that I really did enjoy with the research here is finding out that, in a lot of Western folklore, it is put a bullet in its head, rip its heart out, stab it with a cross, and you've defeated it. I like the humanity here that comes with you're a monster, but you can be saved.
Right. Yeah, two souls, they say. And just isolation and trauma ultimately can, in one way or another, bring out the worst.
And as you said, maybe sophisticated isn't the word, but almost enlightened in a way that you understood the human
Right.
condition, whether the story was different from what Western belief is or not. You understood and knew how to make it into a story that actually made sense and was, fuck when people want to come take over America, the colonialism, and go, well, these guys don't believe in Jesus, so, they don't know as much as us. The fuck they don't. This whole community believed you could be traumatized and isolated and becoming the worst person on earth, but that you weren't above redemption. You could be saved. That what does that sound a lot like? Love thy brother and all that shit. These guys came up with a version of that that was even better because they weren't out putting people on crosses. They were trying to feed them and bring them back to the fold. Not to compare apples and oranges, yet again, not to knock on anyone's faith, but I'm just saying it really shows you the emotional and spiritual intelligence that these people had.
And before we pivot off to the next portion, just to be all the way exact and whatnot, is that what you're getting from this? That they are literally saying that, or is that just, or are you just exaggerating the whole? You can be the worst person on the earth. Do you think that even with this belief system, there's a there's a sense of belief and not even necessarily belief, conviction and unforgivable sins?
I'm going to say there is, and you'll see that play up later, but it's still that they believe they could still heal you in certain senses and
Right.
want to handle you differently than we would. And that's not to say that at the end of the day, you could ultimately one day be kicked out of the tribe if you did something bad enough, I'm sure, with any tribe in the world. But at least as far as the ones in the Americas that I've researched, like Crazy Horse slept with another man's wife. She was married. He had an affair. Dude shot him in the face. They pushed him to the outskirts of the tribe, took away his shirt and his leadership position, but they still let him be a part of the tribe and earn his way back into the fold. There's a reason he led the battle a little bighorn because they gave him the chance. Now, is that the same as killing someone? No, because then you start to see in the Windigo mythology or the Skinwalker mythology that once you do a sin that is so taboo, there really is no saving you, and all you can do is avoid that person. Now, it isn't even necessarily saying kill that person, it's saying avoid them, cut them out of the tribe. The Skinwalkers go over here, the Wendigo go over there, and we go right here.
Yeah. Mm. That's a lot right there. That's a lot. I'll say one thing. Certain events in history, they just give rise to certain thoughts. I'll say that much, especially concerning revered people, you know. But what's new, right?
Story as old as time. Now, where it really does start to get interesting, and not that it hasn't been already, but a lot of these things are products of their time, right? And we can't talk about the Wendigo without talking about the fur trade. When Europeans arrived, they changed the economy of the North. They introduced a market economy. Suddenly, animals weren't just food, they were currency. Beaver pelts, fox furs. This created pressure. It led to overhunting. It led to resource depletion. The Wendigo complex became exacerbated by these new stressors. The fur trade caused population dislocations. It forced tribes into new territories, often competing for dwindling resources. It created a dependence on mercantile monopolies like the Hudson's Bay Company. If the company's store was empty, or if you didn't have enough furs to trade for flour, you starved. The external pressure cooker created the perfect conditions for the Windigo to thrive. Starvation became more common, isolation became more common, as trappers moved further afield to find fur-bearing animals. The myth evolved. It wasn't just about winter anymore. It was about the disruption of the traditional way of life. It became a way to explain the madness of a world turned upside down by commerce. The Wendigo became a specter haunting the trap lines, a manifestation of the anxiety produced by a changing world where the old rules of survival were being rewritten by foreign markets.
Ain't that a bitch though? You said that basically starvation in those areas they increased, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just basically stressful ways of life they increase. And I mean, tale as old as time. Speaking of that, it's just funny to see how in every segment of history you see how new luxuries, so to speak, of life, they don't increase the quality of life. And it's so obvious.
And it's tenfold, 10 times when you look at that difference when it comes to native population. When it's usually when the colonialists come in, life doesn't get better for you. It may get slightly better for them and harder in a lot of other ways, but it gets 100% harder for you. That what this was, you had the French coming in, trapping beavers and fox and bears and all these other animals, and the First Nations people, they hunted and fished and did all this, yes, but they did it with a conservationist mindset. They weren't trying to overfish or overhunt. They knew if we kill this many animals, this population will never come back and we'll never have fox fur again. The French fur trappers, they didn't give a shit. It was, let's kill everything we can, and if it doesn't come back, fuck it. It's not our problem. So these people were isolated, having to leave the lands they loved and hunted and fished for generations. They had to go to the crappier lands that had less food, and they starved and separated as a big part of this.
Hmm. Hmm. And just speaking of social experiments that are kind of unintentional, this is a good example as any that, and I'm not putting this disclaimer out there to be politically correct. I'm just putting it out there to say that not even to disrespect anybody's belief, but this is a good example as any that people's beliefs really come from and are really strengthened by stressful times, stressful moments, moments of anxiety, et cetera, et cetera, because there's a correlation, like you brought out, of course, that, I mean, there's a correlation between the rise of this story and stressful times brought about by the fur trade and things like that. And this is a good as time as any to bring up this stat because this is a kind of a race-based show, but there's statistics that point to towards the fact that Black Americans have worship or just worship God or just practice religion with a higher propensity than any other ethnicity or any other exact type of people. And yeah, I can definitely say there's a reason why we love not only Christianity so much, is kind of probably the most obvious and what's stereotyped as the biggest black folk loving religion. But Islam, we created two of our own versions of that. You know what I mean? But between the Nation of Islam and the Nation of Gods and Earths.
I feel that, and I definitely, it makes you think because you look at the struggles and stressors people go through. And like one of the things I researched, and I'm not the one to speak on it like a professional, but when you look at like the people that survived Auschwitz and stuff. I've done so much research into how did the Jewish people still believe in God, and there's so many different schools of thought on that as well, where some of them believe this is why it happened, some of them believe this, and then this mass of people here just never believed again, and they never got their faith back, and it really does just make you really when you see this happen in history, it's interesting to see the pivots and the ways it goes, grows, or it gets dropped altogether.
Mhm. Yeah, I can get with that.
Now, here's where it gets real fun, people, because we don't just do history here. We're at the crossroads because we're all fans of true crime. Let's be so honest. So let's combine the two loves. We got to turn from the mythology to the history because, as you were saying, Alberto, the history kind of dictates the mythology in so many ways. Because people did believe they were turning into Wendigos, and people died because of it. The most famous and perhaps most heartbreaking case is Swift Runner, Kaki Si Kuchin. Swift Runner was a Cree hunter, living in what is now Alberta in 1879. He was a big man, well respected. He had even worked as a guide for the Northwest Mounted Police. He was a man who knew the land, a man of status. But the winter of 1878 was brutal. Swift Runner took his family, his wife, his 6 children, and his mother in law out into the bush for the winter trapping season. They were isolated. In spring, Swift Runner returned to the Catholic mission alone. He looked surprisingly healthy. He wasn't emaciated. He didn't look like a man who had barely survived. He told the priest that his family had starved to death, but he seemed jovial. He was cracking jokes. He was acting weird. He was screaming in his sleep. The police got suspicious. They traveled to his winter camp. What they found was a slaughterhouse. They found bones stripped of flesh. They found a pot full of human fat. Swift Runner hadn't just eaten his family to survive, he had butchered them. And here is the detail that chills the blood. He killed his youngest son after the weather had turned and he could have hunted game. This wasn't survival cannibalism, like the Donner Party. This was something else. This was a compulsion. Swift Runner confessed, but he didn't plead insanity in the Western sense. He claimed he was possessed by Windigo spirits. He said the spirit had entered him. He said his dreams had turned to flesh. He told the court he had been fighting the urge inside him, driving him to do it. The white authorities, of course, saw this as murder. They tried him, convicted him, and hanged him in Fort Saskatchewan in 1879. Before he died, he reportedly made a speech acknowledging his crime, but insisting he was not in control. This case is a collision of worlds. To the Canadian law, Swift Runner was a monster, a cold-blooded killer. To the Cree community, he was a victim of spiritual infection. They believed he was telling the truth about the possession. It highlights the tragedy of Wendigo psychosis. Was he mentally ill? Was it a breakdown caused by the trauma of famine? Or was it a desperate attempt to frame his horrific actions within a cultural narrative that made sense to him? I didn't do this. The monster did. The fact that he killed when food was available suggests a profound psychological break, one that his culture had a specific name for.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of, I think it was Julius Caesar, the guy we talked about in the show way back yonder. He was a guy, he had epilepsy, I think. They probably just looked at that, or I think they did, is just ingenious strokes of influence and wisdom from above, things like that. And this is definitely reminiscent of that. Just people who don't have just the right verbiage, I guess you could kind of say, for common occurrences in the anatomy of people.
You are dead on that. It was Julius Caesar. It was fits of epilepsy, and they did believe he was being touched by the divine. And you're not wrong in that sense that sometimes the same mythologies that can strengthen a community can also almost become its undoing if they lean too much into it. Now, could they have fixed this man? I couldn't tell you because he sounded off his rocker, but they would have tried to give him soup and seen what was wrong with him before they cast judgment, which is, what I was trying to kind of touch on before, that I do find that is that a strength of a community or is that a weakness? And is it a strength or a weakness to try to rehabilitate the person even if they're that far gone?
I mean, ultimately, I know you often say you don't want to offend people's belief systems and shit, but when it comes to things like this, you kind of got to throw your fucks out the window when it comes to that and say, yeah, it's a weakness. I mean, there's really no way of getting around that. I mean, especially when it comes to the fact that you say, I think twice, if not three times during your last passage that there was food available, yet and still he decided to do what? So, I know what I mean? And it would be sick enough if it was just any little kid, but your own flesh and blood.
I think that is an excellent way to put it, and I think that's a good way to look at it. That I'm all for rehabilitating people that can be, but once you start literally boiling the fat off of your family when there's food you could hunt nearby, it does start to sound, as we were talking before on the Taiping episode, when we were talking about, okay, is this guy crazy or crazy like a fox? I think this was someone that was trying to be crazy like a fox that was like, you know what? I'm going to kill them all, I'm going to eat them all, and then I can start anew, but I can say the Wendigo did it, so at least my tribe will be okay with it.
Yeah, there's always those examples, people who are gonna, I suppose, test their limits.
And you really see the limit testing come up because this brings us to the controversial term Wendigo psychosis. In the early 20th century, white anthropologists and psychiatrists got obsessed with the idea. They claimed that Algonquin people suffered from a unique culture bond, mental illness, where they believed they were turning into cannibals. They wrote papers about it. It became a famous case study in psychology textbooks. It was treated as scientific fact. But modern research tells us it was mostly fake, or at least heavily misinterpreted. Scholars like Lou Marano in the 1980s went back and looked at the records. They found almost no verifiable cases of people actually going crazy and eating people due to psychosis in the way the anthropologists described. Most of the historical Wendigo executions were actually cases of triage homicide or mercy killing. Picture this. In 1750, a harsh winter, food is gone. You have an elderly relative who is delirious from starvation. They are violent. They are threatening the group. They are hallucinating. They are a burden on the limited resources. The community decides they have to die for the group to survive. To justify this terrible act, killing a grandmother or a sick brother, they frame it in the Wendigo myth. He was turning Wendigo. We had to stop him. It provided a culturally acceptable rationale for a heartbreaking decision. It turned a pragmatic execution into a spiritual necessity. The Western scientists came in, ignored the context of starvation and trauma, and labeled it a mental illness. They pathologized the indigenous culture. They said, look at these savages. They go crazy and eat each other. It was a colonial lie. The psychosis wasn't in the people, it was in the anthropologist's interpretations. It was a failure to distinguish their belief, emics, and behavior, ethics.
This right here, it's interesting to see for me because it's the first example of me seeing what I always see as far as the William Shockleys and the Johann Blumenbachs of the world. You always have those guys who try to legitimize white superiority complexes as study worthy proof and scientific fact and things like that. And this is an example of that happening on the Native American side. So it's an interesting take for me to see it happen is I think it's pretty original as far as me, as far as it being my first time seeing something like this, where quote unquote scientific data is used to racially deconstruct another group of people.
Without taking that cultural or that belief system into mind. Exactly. You're dead on that. And it is to show exactly what I said in that passage. Look at these savages, they go crazy and eat each other. It's another way to dehumanize people and try to do it through scientific fact. That comparison is spot on. And sadly, you know as well as I do, this isn't the only time you see this. This may be the first time on this show we've brought it up on the Native American side, but I bet you we get a couple dozen more Native American stories through and recorded, you're going to see it a lot more. And it is insane to think like it's the same way when you look at how the conquistadors took the Aztec belief system and everything we knew for a long time only came from them. And it's like, well, but you're only hearing half the story, and it's the half that didn't really bother to interpret anything and understand it in a bigger context. They're taking Aztec belief, putting it onto Spanish belief, and going, well, this is what they think. And as we see here with the Windigo and with all these other cultures they try to do this to, it doesn't work because you're only getting a very tiny speck of the story.
And isn't it funny that obviously throughout African culture and throughout Native American culture, these rumors and these theories of, yeah, they're savage cannibals are just so apparent. And not to bring up too much info from past shows, but I think I bring up at least once in a show way back another show way back yonder, how really the whole vampire phenomenon that we have today, it's based in stories about the cannibalism that was going down in Europe. You know, like Vlad Dracula in real life, his closest approximate, the guy he's based off of was Vlad the Impaler, somebody who is was one of the most famous, if not the most famous cannibal ever, you know. And even over here in America, that's something they were doing when they didn't necessarily. I mean, they had times where I think they didn't even necessarily have to, quote unquote, because there's really no reason to do that. But you know what I mean? There's no famine or anything to bring that deprivation out of you.
Well, and I'll bring up one that the girls are gonna love because they can't get enough of him. No, I'm kidding. But Jeffrey Dahmer, man, you know, it's the same group of people, the same race of people, the same ethnicity that want to go, all these people are cannibals. And it's like, but bro, Jeffrey Dahmer. Like, if you look at all of the instances of cannibalism and people that have been arrested for it, practicing it in America the last 100 years, the majority of them are white people.
Before we pivot off, which would be a great way to pivot off, I see, is first of all, are you familiar with the Sigourney Weaver movie Copycat?
I'm not.
Okay, so it's basically based off of what loosely and somewhat based off of what you were just talking about, really, just as far as the whole demographic of what we were talking about. And she starts off the movie largely speaking to a crowd of people, a class really, because she's a doctor,
Oh, wait a
professor.
minute. Is this the one she wrote the book on the serial killer and the ones trying to kill her?
Uh-huh.
I
And she
have seen
talks
that
about
one.
how mhm. She talks about how most serial killers are white males, 20 to 35. And it's it's pretty it's pretty interesting. You kind of see unintentionally how that stereotype plays out to really help that character because one of the women that he comes up to, he's kind of playing all timid and shy, and he's got his glasses on, his hair is all combed back, and he's looking like just a friendly, shy, timid white male just asking for directions at the time or whatever he asks for. Then she ends up dead, and
Well,
she's really receiving to him too. But yeah,
here's the thing that I always have to bring up too, though, to play devil's advocate and not to take away from how crazy white people are, but they only have those statistics about what a serial killer is because those are the ones that get caught. So think about all the female serial killers, black serial killers, Mexican serial killers, um, of both genders. Maybe they're just saying that white people are really bad at it and white men in particular. And maybe that's a cultural thing. I don't know. Maybe it is when you're not really having to fight half as hard to get twice as far, you do start getting lazy and get caught up more. I'm not saying that's the case or it isn't, but it's just fascinating to think about. Like Eileen Warnos was a female serial killer. She's one of like maybe a couple dozen they've ever caught, if that many. And when you look at all the white guys that were caught, they were usually white guys that were either super weird and broken like Jeffrey Dahmer, or they were like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, where they were pillars of their community and kind of felt like they could get away with it.
I mean, I'm never one to act like the idea. Well, starting off with the black portion, I'm never one to act like the idea of a black serial killer is just something that's completely out of sight of the realm of possibility. But if it was really a system, an activity that had any type of ground or just was really as common or common period, I mean, I think the law would get around it. I mean, I think the law would definitely, for a fact, catch on to it. I mean, some people, I mean, the guy that we're gonna eventually do a story on, King Von, Trap Lil Ross just famously did an uh somewhat 2, 3 hour, something like that documentary labeling him, King Von, as hip hop's first serial killer. So yeah, I suppose in some cases, but again, to my point, he did some he faced some time and for his activities, and possibly was going to face longer time, but we'll get into why he, you know, beat that case and shit when we do the story. But I feel
Now, I
you.
want to let you know, St. Louis, we did have Maury Travis and Terry Blair as two black serial killers. Not that it's
Mm.
common, but we can at least, hey, St. Louis can claim some fame on that there. Look. Maury Travis, I remember when he was out doing his thing, man. It was when we were kids, and he had like this sex dungeon in Ferguson, and I remember my teacher trying to frame it as like, oh yeah, there's this guy with the sex dungeon in Ferguson, yada yada. Like, oh man, is he just throwing people in there? Like, not even realizing what a serial killer was. It's so funny when you grow up and you find out, like, oh no, he had a type he was killing, and it was not little boys. Thankfully,
Mm. And Ferguson, eh?
he's a
Damn, man.
fascinating one.
Just
I'll
makes
send
you
you the
think.
link for him.
Just to know, like, certain people who mm, live certain lifestyles were right down the road. Like, we watch all these movies and stuff like Copycat, and even I've been really heavy on the Scream series recently. Like, people who are like main the main characters of the killers in the first movie who were just really obsessed with killing and worship that lifestyle and stuff. To think that people like that are people who you've probably met or bumped into before.
I want to say they say statistically before you die, you'll have been within an arm's reach of a serial killer at least 3 or 4 different times.
Yeah, I remember you saying that stat before. I figured you were gonna bring it up, but yeah, that's believable.
And you start to see, because speaking of people being monsters, the Wendigo isn't just a monster from the past. See, like that segue? It is alive and well today, but it has evolved. And boy, I think it's just as relevant today as it ever was when it was first created. In contemporary indigenous thought, in literature, art, and activism, the Wendigo has become the ultimate metaphor for colonialism and capitalism. Think about it. What is a corporation? As we were saying with CEOs and politicians earlier, it consumes resources. It grows larger the more it eats. It has an insatiable hunger for profit. It doesn't care about the community, it only cares about itself. It destroys the land, the forests, the water to feed its hunger. That is the Wendigo. Indigenous scholars like Winona LaDuke and Robin Wall Kimmerer argue that we are living in a Wendigo economy. We are consuming the planet faster than it can regenerate. We are eating our own future. The phrase colonialization was our Wendigo is powerful. The residential schools, that was the Wendigo eating the children. The destruction of the buffalo, that was the Wendigo eating the food source. The pipeline cutting through sacred land, that is the Wendigo's veins. This recontextualization is brilliant. It takes an ancient fear, starvation, and applies it to a modern fear, environmental collapse. It transforms a Wendigo from a monster of the woods to a monster of the boardroom. We see this in literature too. Louise Erdrich's novel The Round House uses the Wendigo to explore justice and retribution. Sherry Demoline's The Marrow Thieves depicts a dystopian future where people hunt indigenous people for their bone marrow, a literal consumption of bodies that mirrors the Wendigo's hunger. These works reclaim the myth. They take it back from the antlered monster of Hollywood and restore the moral weight. Western movies like Antlers or The Wendigo almost always get it wrong. They give it antlers, which it never had traditionally. They make it a generic zombie werewolf thing. They strip away the context. Indigenous art restores that depth. It makes the Wendigo a symbol of resilience by naming the monster you can fight it.
Mm. Yeah, that was a nice little segue, if I do say so myself. And ultimately, it fits into the future as all good history does, because it can be applied to how we're living today, not just as singular people, but collectively, globally, even how we're being resourceful or the lack thereof, ultimately.
And the importance of community, even when it's on a global level, I think is something that is so important. As we were saying earlier in the pre-show and stuff, that the bigger the technology gets and the closer the world gets, the more we really do have to look out for each other on a global level. And, maybe we do need to stop a few of these CEOs that are trying to devour the world. And it is interesting, as we were talking before, how something that could make a culture weak when you let them hide behind a Wendigo psychosis is the same thing that gives it strength when you show it's a Wendigo economy.
And all in all, what do you get out of is it kind of interesting to you that Hollywood, of all people, decide to add antlers, or is it just pretty predictable, if anything?
I think it's predictable, but it's predictable and laughable because when you think about it, it's as we were saying before that you're only giving a fraction of the story, and the real thing can be even scarier. Tell me I'm wrong. Yeah, a monster with antlers or whatever, cool, but it's generic. We're used to that. That's not really that scary. But a man murdering his entire family and eating them when there's food right next to him, and then blaming it on Wendigo psychosis, and that's the actual true cultural point there. You see what I'm saying? Which one is actually more scarier at the end of the day?
I could see that. And while we're on Hollywood and history, of course, did you know anything about Hollywood actually being named after a type of wood that would be found in the Hollywoods, and druids would use that wood to cast spells?
I didn't, but now that you say it, that makes so much sense, and that's actually low key kind of awesome. It just sucks they get the stories wrong. And like you said, was it casting Charlize Theron in a movie about Egyptian history and shit? It gets a little wonky, but
Yeah, yeah, I hear you. I think that was actually about the our girl that we had just talked about in the movie Copycat, Sigourney Weaver. I remember the Gods of Egypt movie that came out last decade. Yeah, I think 2014 it was. Yeah.
that was it. I remember you bringing it up, and all I could think of is, okay, they put a white woman in this. That's awesome. Go
Yeah, seeing
Hollywood. You guys really
Sigourney,
know diversity.
yeah, Sigourney Weaver playing an African queen. It's like only in Hollywood, right?
And the same thing with this. That's why it's like it'd be nice to see more creators of color get into Hollywood because then we can start seeing these myths, these legends, these portions of history depicted and displayed in the way they were meant to be instead of some white guy with no skin in the game's interpretation of it.
That's all we can hope for, to speak for the trees, so to speak, literally and figuratively.
And speaking for the trees, I hate to do this, people. I'm going to throw the glasses on. It has been a hell of a ride, but let me say this much. How do we wrap up the legend of the Wendigo? It is the most terrifying monster in North American folklore, not because of its claws or its ice heart, but because of what it represents. The Wendigo isn't an alien. It isn't a demon from hell. It is us. It is what happens when we lose our humanity. It is what happens when we decide that our hunger is more important than your life. The genius of the Algonquin myth is that it recognizes a fundamental truth about human nature. Greed is a sickness. If you feed it, it grows. If you indulge it, it consumes you. The Wendigo is the warning that rings out across the frozen lakes. You are never safe from yourself. Whether it's a starving trapper in 1879 or a billionaire hoarding wealth in 2026, the sickness is the same. The ice heart is the same. And the cure, as the old Ojibwe story taught us, the cure isn't always a bullet. Sometimes the cure is warmth. The cure is sharing. The cure is remembering that we are all in this winter together. The cure is melting the ice heart with the heat of community. Take care of yourselves and keep the fire burning. Any final thoughts, Mr. Talberto? Anything you'd like to plug?
You know, time flies when you're having fun, of course, and I think we definitely did this with that one, and I think they'll definitely have fun listening. All in all, keep listening, you bastards, because we'll keep pumping these shits out. TOLBERT Simpson is the Instagram handle. Hit a motherfucker up. I'm always available. And yeah, world's most dangerous podcast out.
Join us next week. We're going to be getting into Yasuke, the Black Samurai. I think the world is going to love it, Mr. Talberto.